Weiwei&Timothy, welcome to the Munk Debates podcast, and this our first video conference version of these debates. So great to have you both on the program.
Great to be with you.
Great, nice to see you.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, the ability for us, and more importantly, our listeners, to spend this time with both of you to tackle and address, I think, an issue that is top of mind for many people around the world, which is the respective response to this pandemic from China and how it has seemingly responded quite effectively to the threat of COVID-19 versus much of the rest of the world, where I think it's fair to say the response has been mixed and the results are mixed. And many people have commented, have raised this question, does the Chinese response to COVID provide a further important test proof that the Chinese model, its system of government, is in fact superior to liberal democracy? As we've seen, many liberal democratic governments really struggling right now to rein in the spread of COVID within their populations and within their borders. So let's dive into this debate. What we're going to do is put 2 minutes on the clock for each of you for your opening statements. Weiwei, you're arguing in favor of our motion today, be it resolved. This pandemic and China's response shows that its model of governance is superior to liberal democracy. So let's hear your opening remarks, and then we'll have Timothy respond in kind. Please take us away.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. You know, essentially, the China model in fighting COVID-19 is based on this overall idea that people's lives matter most. People's lives come first before economic and commercial interests. As a result, China has made all its efforts possible to save each and every life to the maximum possible, and we have succeeded more or less. And in contrast, from our point of view, the Western model is essentially about business and commercial interest first. As a result, they have lost many good opportunities in fighting the disease, which is deeply regrettable. And if you look at the human cost, the death toll of the United States, by the end of May, it's already 22 times that of China in absolute terms. China population is 4 times and more larger than the US population. As a result, if in per capita terms, today China is at least 100 times safer than United States, safer from COVID-19 related deaths or infection. Yeah. And secondly, China model is about a kind of what we call people's war. Whether from top down or from bottom up, at each level of society, people are united, mobilized, determined to fight the disease. And over closely, almost 500,000 Chinese medical staff were dispatched from different parts of China to Wuhan, to Hubei province, the hardest hit region in China. And then over 2 million volunteers were mobilized to really protect their neighborhood, their villages, their whatever workplace. If you were there in China during that 2 months, you were touched each and every day by this kind of ordinary people, their sense of sacrifice, their sense of it's our homeland, we must defend it, you know. And if you look at these 2 cases, you will find that, you know, the Chinese model is about really leadership and a kind of unity and the trust between the state and the leaders. In contrast with Western model, it's about more or less a divided society. And it reminds me of the movie, you know, The Darkest Hour. If it's a war, Nazi Germany will bombing UK or other European countries, but you don't have Winston Churchill. You don't have Franklin Roosevelt. You know, that's the problem with our leadership. So which model is better? The Chinese model is better. And thirdly, the China model is about science and technology. at each and every level, at each and every way. And the Chinese put emphasis on sciences and respect scientists and their conclusions. As a result, I'll give an example. Within less than 2 months, China has produced 7 editions of clinical guidance to reflect the whatever progress every passing day or days, so that it will guide the whatever work in whole China, and even we recommend this to the international community. For instance, it's very simple. We said from day one, you have to do not allow any visit to elderly homes, because elderly are more vulnerable to this pandemic. If other countries, UK included, can copy this Chinese experience, you can save many, many hundreds of thousands of lives in the world, in the UK, in the United States, especially elderly people. And then we have to look at this China model in a broader context. I call it Chinese model of governance. Roughly, in the political domain, it's about selection plus election. If the Western model is about election only. If you look at the requirement for top leadership in China, of the 7 members of standing committee of the political bureau, in most cases, most of them have worked at least twice as the #1 of a Chinese province, as a governor or party secretary. They have literally governed over 100 million people before they came to their present positions. So arguably, this is the world's most competent leadership. That's why we are able to beat the virus in such a way that most other countries cannot do. And then economically, it's about mixed economy. The state plays its role, and the market plays its own roles, and they complement each other in an ideal situation. This model is not perfect. We are trying to reform many aspects of this model. Yet, the China model ensures that China has not experienced any financial crisis. China has not experienced any economic crisis since this model was put forward in the year 1992. Yeah. And China has created the world's largest middle class. In the social domain, this model is about interactions or positive interactions between the state and society. So the Chinese state is far more efficient and responsible to demands of the society than Western so-called democracies, And then, all these 3 dimensions of a China model are geared towards one objective, that is what I call the centering on improving people's livelihood, both in material terms, in non-material terms, and cultural terms. That explains China's dramatic rise. And then if we look at the opinion surveys, the latest one is from the Guardian's report, Democracy Perception Index. They surveyed many people in 53 countries. Only 3 of them consider the United States did better than China in fighting the COVID-19. The rest think China has done better or much better. And in this survey, 95% Chinese think the performance of the Chinese government is very good. So that's the highest among all the countries surveyed. Another survey is the Ipsos survey 2019 for last year. The question is very simple. Do you think your country is on the right track? In the case of China, 91%. In the case of UK, 21%. In the case of France, 20%. So I think, with all our modesty, whatever, the Chinese model, which is not perfect, we are constantly trying to improve upon this model. But indeed, in many ways, it has performed better than the Western liberal democracy model. I think it's time for the West to think seriously major political reforms. Otherwise, the decline of the West may continue and even speed up, which will be an unfortunate case for many Western countries. That's all for my short introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Weiwei, for those opening remarks. I'm going to now turn it over to Timothy, who's arguing against the motion, against the assertion that China's seemingly at this point successful response to the pandemic shows that its model of governance, as Weiwei has just explained it, its social aspects, its economic aspects, its focus on public health is somehow superior to liberal democracy. So Timothy, thank you for coming on the program. Let's have your opening remarks.
It's a great pleasure to be debating with Zhang Weiwei, and there's a very interesting conversation to be had about the relative merits of the Chinese system and Western liberal democracies. I'll try to make my introductory 2 minutes perhaps slightly shorter than Weiwei's 2 minutes, but let me remind you that the motion before us is China's ability to defeat COVID-19 proves its system of governance is a better model than liberal democracy. And that seems to me, to be frank, an absurd proposition for at least 3 reasons. First of all, because we haven't yet defeated COVID-19. As we speak, there's a new outbreak in Beijing and half of Beijing is under lockdown, so we haven't defeated it. Secondly, because while it is perfectly true, and I would happily acknowledge, that in the later period through February, March, there was a really impressive mobilization of the apparatus of an authoritarian system to control, to lock down, to test. The fact that the rest of the world is struggling with this deadly virus is unfortunately due to China. We don't know exactly where it came from and how, but what we do know is that it came from China. And the fact that it came from China and spread from China is a failure of your governance system. Moreover, in the crucial early weeks, late December through January, in classic authoritarian or indeed totalitarian fashion, what this system did was to deny, to try to shut up people who pointed out that there was a deadly virus on the way. The name of Dr. Li Wenliang, who subsequently died of the virus, should stand for many. And allowed, I mean, I have the detailed chronology here on my iPad. In Wuhan, denied, said it was mostly a mild condition, and then allowed large public gatherings to take place, particularly allowed people to travel over Chinese New Year. And that is actually what has given the rest of the world this deadly virus. Thirdly, and most importantly in our context, which is about the Chinese system versus liberal democracy, no one is going to pretend that the United States under Donald Trump handled this well. They handled it disastrously. Few people will pretend that Britain under Boris Johnson handled this well. They've handled it very badly. But some of the countries in the world which have handled it best of all are in fact democracies. Weiwei talked about respect for science. Chancellor Angela Merkel knows a great deal more about science than President Xi Jinping. She is a scientist, and she used her scientific knowledge to give a very impressive performance in Germany. The most impressive countries, bar none, are South Korea, a democracy, New Zealand, a democracy, and most interestingly, Taiwan, a Chinese democracy, which handled it so impressively that in a country of 24 million people, we have had so far just 7 deaths. So Britain, with somewhat over 60 million, has more than 40,000 deaths. 24 million people, only 7 deaths. Hugely impressive discipline, testing, use of technology in a Chinese democracy. So there is indeed a Chinese state that has handled COVID-19 very well, but it's the Chinese democracy and not the Chinese dictatorship.
Thank you, Timothy. Well, let's get into our rebuttals. This is an opportunity for our listeners to hear each of you react to each other's opening statements, to pull out some of the key points that we can then dig deeper into during our conversation between the 3 of us. So, Weiwei, what do you want to focus on in terms of Timothy's opening remarks?
Well, I will try to answer in a reverse order. starting with Taiwan, New Zealand, South Korea doing better than China. China's civilizational state, the size of roughly 100 average European states put together. So if we put aside Hubei, Wuhan, aside, because these two places encountered the sudden attack, all of a sudden unprepared. For the other provinces, I would say they have all done virtually much better than these Western democracies and these countries, regions you mentioned just now. You look at the Fujian province, opposite Taiwan, much larger population than Taiwan, but only one death. You look at Zhejiang province, a much larger population than Taiwan, and then South Korea, only one death. You look at New Zealand, my goodness, it's 1/5 of Shanghai's population. It's 5 million only, but 22 deaths. Shanghai, 1 death. And Germany, I know it's doing much better than UK, than some other Western countries, but still by Chinese standards, not doing very well. Because if you look at the death toll in Germany, it's already something closer to 9,000. So it's almost double that of China's death toll. And China population is 16 times larger than Germany. And concerning the origin of disease and so-called spread from China, indeed, there are no evidence whatsoever that spread from China. You have to check facts and give evidence. If you check this patient 0 in UK, it's from other parts of Europe. Patient 0 in United States, it's from Europe. Patient 0 in Australia is from United States. Patient 0 in France is likely to be from Northern Paris. So it's more likely that, the disease occurred suddenly, more or less simultaneously in different parts of the world. And China is maybe arguably the first discover and determine the nature of the disease. And WHO has said clearly, China has managed to contain 99% of cases within the Chinese border. So no single patient 0 from China, and no travel from China to other parts of the world after 23rd January, when the city was blocked. Now, concerning respect for science, indeed, I suggest to read the comments made by this editor-in-chief of Lancet, Mr. Horton. He said in a debate with BBC, whatever forum, he said, my goodness, we've published 5 full-length papers on this disease in the last week of January. We knew exactly the nature of the disease. It's deadly, it's contagious, it's human-human transition beyond 0 hour 2. But he said most countries in the West did not pay attention to it, ignored it. He said it's a scandal, national scandal. So much time wasted, whole February wasted, and early March wasted. The United States even wasted more time. So big lessons to learn. From my point of view, I think the Western ideological bias and the kind of, arrogance, if China did something, it must be wrong. It must be dictatorship. It's against human rights, concentration camp. No, we've done so many for the ordinary people, for the life of the people. So this costs Europe and many Western countries dearly. I'll give you an example. Our experience told us, very simple, you should not allow any visit to elderly homes because this disease hurts this community much deadly than other people. So just do that as we did, so we don't have any casualties in elderly homes so far at this stage, the information I got. But if we could have done that, in Western countries, hundreds, thousands of elderly lives could have been saved. Now, concerning Dr. Li Wenliang, we have a lot of sympathy for him, indeed. By the way, he's a Communist Party member, good party member. And don't forget, it's a flu season. When he said it's a SARS-like explosion, it's not true, It's not scientifically correct. At that time, it took 3 days to establish the result of test, positive or negative. So when he said it's a flu-like, I think any government in the world can dare say this is correct, we should start whatever emergency, because the flu, the disease all the time. You will make the declaration emergency all the time. This is unfair. So China established this fact. It's contagious, human-to-human transmission to the degree of RO2, which means highly contagious. It infects one, infects two and more people. So we started a lockdown of Wuhan on 23rd. So this is a very, very important to see. I mentioned on the 20th January established particular fact, and 23rd January we began the lockdown. And so it's very efficient. Just imagine in Europe, United States, you spend 2 months, 3 months debating the value, the merit of face masks. It's already proved so useful in China. Again, China spent less than 1 month. We established it. We have determined the fact it's a new virus. We have published this genomic sequence and sent it to the international community. So I think that would be fair towards China. No wonder, Jane O'Neill, Chatham House chair, said, "My goodness, it happened in China. If it had happened in other countries like India, it could be much more disastrous and consequential."
Weiwei, thank you for that rebuttal of Timothy's opening statement. I'm now going to go to Timothy. You have the same opportunity. We'll put 2 minutes or so on the clock and let you pull at some of the key arguments of Weiwei's that you'd like to tackle for our listeners.
Well, there's a great old Chinese proverb, seek truth through facts, which I hope we both agree on. I think it is a pretty well-established fact that the virus came from China, but to adjudicate that claim, I hope we could all agree on an independent international commission to investigate fully exactly what happened.
Yes.
I'm very glad you agree, because to try and prevent it happening next time.
We even,
if I may continue my counter rebuttal, I think it's a bit rich, if I may say so, Weiwei, to say if we just put aside Wuhan, Hubei, because that's rather like saying we'll talk about England but put aside London. I mean, this is the place where the whole outbreak developed, so we can't just put that aside in one case. The crucial point here is this, to move from epidemiology, because neither of us are epidemiologists, although the whole world is now full of amateur epidemiologists, to political science. And there, I think the key statement is this. This is not a clincher either way for the argument about the relative merits of authoritarian regimes versus liberal democracies. There are authoritarian regimes which have handled this extremely badly, Russia and Iran being two dramatic examples. And there are some which have handled it after the initial phase. And you didn't address my really important point about both the origins of the virus and the initial cover-up in the weeks in January, which is well documented and is a serious failing. I hope you will agree. But let's agree, relatively well. There are democracies that have handled it very badly, like the United States, but there are also significant, large democracies. Germany is not a small country. South Korea is not a small country at all, that have handled this extremely well. So democracy versus authoritarian is not the key determinant. And I would like you to say something about Taiwan, because your whole argument, your famous China wave argument, is about the civilizational state. Here we have a Chinese society which has actually preserved great continuity of traditional Chinese culture, which I hugely admire, which is undoubtedly a democracy, an imperfect democracy, but nonetheless a democracy, and which has handled this extremely well.
Well, great.
Okay.
That's a terrific segue into our moderated middle. So, Weiwei, let's kick off our three-way conversation by having you address this specific point of Taiwan and why that isn't an important proof point that, in fact, democracy is not only a democracy, but a Chinese democracy culturally has excelled at addressing this pandemic.
And I will come to this point by point, because in Taiwan's democracy, I said many times, it's a typical case of a failed and poor quality democracy. At this particular moment, over 2 million Taiwanese, Taiwan has a population of 23 million, close to 24 million. They live, study, work in China, in the Chinese mainland. This is what you may call, if you have to politicize the issue, vote by feet. Even Shenzhen, its budget is larger than Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's leader. So really, we are very open, you know, Taiwan, people laugh at Taiwan's experience. Over 20 years, 25 years, income, most people did not increase. You know, I said from hopefulness to collapse. Without China's help, China gave its really trade surplus. Otherwise, Taiwan's economy will be hit badly. So I'm not at all worried about eventual unification. It's not East Germany with West Germany. China is 10 times even more stronger than Taiwan, even in terms of attraction of this whole success of China. And the second is concerned this independent inquiry. I support absolutely, you know, if it's an independent as defined in the WHO decision not long ago adopted, which the United States did not endorse. It's a pity. You know, even the US admitted last September, October, November, they already had a huge flu, affected over one-fifth of its population. And many, many died, and some cases were already kind of COVID, coronavirus cases. And China suggests we open up investigation on that as well. You know, there are many cases. You go to Paris, there is a hospital, there is patient zero. It's born in France, it's in France last November, December. So it's great to have full investigations. There are already some papers there, we can follow that. Now, concerns the whole argument about democracy versus authoritarian regimes, I strongly advise Professor Ash to change this paradigm a bit. I would often argue, you know, it's because we have different definition of democracy. In your case, it's more about the multi-party system, one person, one vote. To my mind, this is at best procedural democracy. It had nothing to do necessarily with real and substantial democracy. So let's discuss another paradigm called good governance versus bad governance. Good governance can take the form of Western democracy, liberal democracy model, can also take other forms of political system. China is a good case. And bad governance can also take the Western liberal model. The US handling of pandemic is a typical failure. It's a typical case of bad governance, and UK is not much better. So I think that will allow us to focus on something we can build up a meaningful conversation. And to my mind, if we have to discuss democracy, we have to focus on definition. I think good governance is the real democracy. Otherwise,
okay, let's go in that direction, because I think that's an interesting way to kind of open this up and expand a bit just beyond the pandemic to talk about this tension, Timothy, that Weiwei is bringing out here between a kind of a procedural approach to governance, one in China that, you know, there are laws, there is the rule of law, there are procedures in place that structure a relationship between the individual and the state, versus representative democracy. And arguably, representative democracy has amplified some of the tensions and pressures around this pandemic. I think of the controversy around mask wearing in the United States, which kind of seems absurd, but now this privileging of the representative function of democracy has turned something that should be a public health no-brainer into seemingly a legitimate policy debate. Let's have you respond to that.
Thank you, Rudyard. I mean, first of all, just a couple more words on Taiwan, because it's a really important case. I mean, Taiwan can't help being small anyway, any more than Switzerland can help being small. It just is. So that's kind of irrelevant. Switzerland is small and Russia is large, but that doesn't tell us anything about the quality of their systems. When you mentioned unification, I think it's important to clarify that you mean by that unification with the free, voluntary consent of the people of Taiwan. Well, the opinion polls in Taiwan are telling us a very, very different story. A majority of Taiwanese actually now identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. So I think history is going in the other direction. So that's an important point to make, that which should be with the freely expressed consent of the people of Taiwan, if it ever comes about. And that takes me to the democracy point, Rudyard. Simplest definition of democracy is a system in which the people can change their government. In that sense, however imperfect, Taiwan is a democracy and the People's Republic of China is not. If you could tell me the name of the leading opposition candidate against President Xi Jinping in the last election, I'd be glad to hear it. Right? So it's not, in that very elementary and very important sense, a democracy. It doesn't have freedom of speech. It doesn't have the possibilities of deliberative democracy, as we see in the case of the really awful things that are happening to Hong Kong, the introduction of the national security law, the arrest of exemplary Democrats like Martin Lee. The Chinese system and authorities are actually extremely nervous, even about very limited expressions of a will for democracy and self-government. But beyond that, Rudyard, to your point, I think it's completely implausible to argue that it's intrinsic to the nature of representative democracy that states will handle these things badly. Not the case at all. There are many democracies, as I've said before, which have handled them extremely well. Why? Because handling a pandemic depends on a high degree of social trust and social self-discipline. That's the only way you control it, right? By people being willing to have the app, willing to get tested, willing to self-isolate if need be. And actually, a democracy like Germany, and indeed like South Korea, has been absolutely excellent, precisely in winning and securing social trust and support without coercion, because the Germans have elected Angela Merkel and they absolutely trust her when she tells them they have to stay at home. So I don't think for a moment that one can make a causal connection between the terrible story of what's happened with COVID-19 in the United States and some sort of general weakness of representative democracy.
Weiwei, do you want to come back on this point about this
and
perceived strengths of a procedural system?
Concerning Taiwan, indeed, I said many times, Taiwan's quality of democracy is very poor. You can see all kinds of scientific political science studies. And Taiwan used to be of the four little dragons. Taiwan is the best in its economic performance. Now it's the worst. Up to last year. And so I think concerning unification, it's contained in the Taiwan's constitution. Taiwan is part of China. So any attempt to move Taiwan away from China will violate Taiwan's own constitution, of course, violate Chinese constitution and anti-secession law. So China will deal with this according to law. And I think soon, after this decision on Hong Kong, which I will explain later, we'll have more on Taiwan. This is in the process of peaceful reunification. I always say Chinese look at the trend. The trend is in favor of unification. Economically, the two sides are already unified. If China do not deliver any help to Taiwan, Taiwan's economy collapse overnight. So as strong as that. From that, we'll have other logics. And concerning this democracy, I really, after so many problems emerge in the West, whether it's Greece, the birthplace of Western democracy, bankrupt. UK, with all my respect, my passion for British culture, still, with the Brexit and all the chaos and opinion survey so low, whatever, and United States have Donald Trump. So this kind of procedural democracy have to go certain reforms. I said the Western liberal democracy have 3 genetic flaws. Really, I doubt very much they can improve itself. Number one, this assumption that human beings are rational. They cast a rational vote. I'm sorry, not with the involvement of money, with the social media, with the populism, will not be able to control. That's a huge challenge for Western democracy. We can handle that, Western democracy. We can plan for next 3-5 years and even next generation. Western model cannot plan for that. Second defect is what I call rights are absolute. even this fighting pandemic. Freedom, liberty, you cannot, if have a lockdown, we will break this in the name of freedom. In Chinese culture, we suggest very humbly but convincingly, there must be a balance between individual freedom and individual responsibility. Otherwise, a society cannot cope with the coming challenges in the 21st century, whether it's virus or natural disasters. And number three is always about procedures, changing government, whatever. No substance, if you want to, for instance, gun control is a problem in the United States. You cannot do anything about it because in the current existing of rule of law, you have no way to fix. You need to revise the constitution, but you cannot even try to do that given the current political context. So this really, all this handicapped the Western liberal democracy. That led to increasingly more and more cases of bad governance.
These are really good key points. I'm glad we're getting to this because we're talking about democracy writ large, and I think that's just a real treat for our listeners. So, Timothy, could you respond to those 3 points? Because there are three, interesting criticisms. One, that Western democracies are locked into these kind of ossified constitutional structures that prevent them from making meaningful reform. Second, they have this tendency, this inclination hardwired into them to privilege individual liberties over kind of collective responsibilities. And third, there's a kind of an inherent kind of chaos in their term elections that don't allow them to plan forward 5, 10, 15 years for a generation. Those are three important critiques that Weiwei has surfaced here. I'd love to get your reply to them.
Pleasure. I'm going to just say a couple of sentences about Taiwan, just to round that off.
You guys in Taiwan.
No, it's a really important point. I mean, first of all, if Hong Kong is an example of peaceful reunification, I wouldn't be very encouraged if I were Taiwanese. Secondly, you say rather grandly, Weiwei, that Taiwan is a poor democracy. Well, I'd rather have a poor democracy than none. And the Taiwanese people seem to quite like it. They say in the famous phrase, a poor thing but our own. So it really is a crucial point that their right to self-determination, that the choice should be made without coercion by the people living in Taiwan. Enough on Taiwan, we've had that. Now to your larger question. So to take the 3 points, what you describe as a kind of constitutional rigidity is a problem particularly in the United States. It is extraordinary that the US system is still struggling because of constraints that were placed in the Constitution 2.5 centuries ago. But there are many, many other Western democracies, in fact, most other Western democracies, which are constantly changing and improving their systems. The Norwegians have several times changed their constitution, the West Germany too. Secondly, on individual freedom versus collective goods, which is, of course, an old argument which goes all the way back to Karl Marx and the socialist critique of bourgeois democracy. What I will say on this is that we in the West have experienced a major crisis of liberalism and of liberal democracy, which goes back in a sense to the triumph of liberal democracy in and after 1989. It was really good for us to have an ideological competitor, the other side of the Iron Curtain. It kept us on our feet, it kept us honest. Absent that competition, we became hubristic and we allowed huge levels of inequality to develop in our societies, both vertically in terms of class and geographically. Whole regions of our countries, the US Rust Belt, the north of England, the southeast of Poland got left behind. We neglected the needs for solidarity and equality on the one hand, and for community and identity on the other. And it is, however, Weiwei, precisely through that chaos which makes you so uncomfortable, the chaos of freedom, the robust, often messy debates that we have, that we are now beginning to work out how we correct those mistakes. So what you are seeing is actually the self-correcting power of freedom, of free countries with not just procedural democracy, but also deliberative democracy with free speech. And what I would say in this, to take this forward, is that we in the West in liberal democracy have had our crisis. Roughly speaking, since the financial crisis of 2008, Western liberal democracies have had one blow after another. I think we're just beginning to turn the corner and come out of it. Your crisis is still in store for you. Because if China were indeed this absolute perfect model of Confucian good government, meritocratic, efficient, harmonious, always concerned only for the welfare of all its people, there wouldn't be any unhappy people there. But there are quite a lot of unhappy people in China at the moment. And the reason for that is that your system is actually a blend of traditional Chinese systems of governance with something extremely familiar to me, because I've been studying it all my life, which is a Leninist system. And my great concern is this. Your book, The China Wave, I have it here. Advertisement for you, Weiwei. Your book came out, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2012. Between 1978 and 2012, I really admired the way in which China was, to use your own phrase, crossing the river by feeling for the stones. A pragmatic evolutionary policy which started with the dedicatee of your book, Deng Xiaoping. But the fact is, since 2012, since Xi Jinping came to power, there's been a sharp reversion to a classic Leninist system, with all power being concentrated again in the single party and all power within the party within the hands of a single leader, which is why I call it a dictatorship, a term that a Marxist should not object to. And we know about the history of Leninism because we have 100 years experience of Leninism. And Leninism is very good at many things, but it is not good at dealing with the challenges of a complex modern economy and society, which is what you have in China. And so I fear that we've had our crisis and yours is yet to come. And I say that with no schadenfreude, because I would much, much rather that China had continued on the course, the pragmatic evolutionary course, developing a system that was genuinely new in history, rather than going back to a clapped out old Leninist model, which never works in the end.
Very interesting. So Weiwei, come back on this point that China's crisis lies ahead, that with this more authoritarian, as Timothy would characterize
it, specifically Leninist
phase that China is in. Yes, a very effective response to a pandemic because the command and control systems are in place. But what does that mean going forward in terms of dealing with the complexity of Chinese society and the demands of the Chinese people?
It reminds me of my debate exactly this time 9 years ago with Mr. Fukuyama, the author of The End of History. At that time, Arab Spring occurred, 2011. He said China may also experience Arab Spring. As the author of End of History, Professor Ash is more or less on the same kind of way of thinking. I said no. I said China will not experience Arab Spring. On the other hand, I made a prediction: the first in the world, Arab Spring will soon become Arab Winter. I made also another prediction. He said that China needs political reform, needs accountability to the people through universal suffrage and through multi-party system. I said that both China and the United States need political reforms, but personally, I think the United States needs more substantial political reform because your political system is a product of pre-industrial era. I made another bold prediction. I said, without meaningful and significant political reform, my concern is the United States may produce a leader, a president, worse off than George W. Bush. Many, many people in the world share this view, my prediction. And thirdly, I made another bold prediction. I said the Western liberal democracy, as it's currently practiced, as you mentioned, regular change of government, whatever, in the long human history, it may be very transient, a short period of time. So that's, we will witness history, see what will befall in front of us. Now, I will explain a bit this idea of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese political system. I call China a civilizational state, which is one of the longest or the longest continuous civilization mingled with a super large modern state. And as a result, its governance tradition is very different, very unique. I would describe Western political party system as partial interest parties. You have each party which represents a certain section of the population, partial interest, and they compete with each other. 51% win, 49% lose. The Chinese had never had this kind of experience in China's long history because China was first unified in 221 BC. You know, we have always practiced, you may call a kind of one-party system, because China as a civilizational state, it's an amalgamation of hundreds of states into one over its long history. That's why I never compare China with Norway or China with South Korea. South Korea is smaller than most Chinese provinces. So you have to understand that each province, I just give you an example, the mentality, the way of thinking, even linguistic structure, except the written language, between Shanghainese people in Shanghai, Pekingese people in Beijing, and Cantonese people in Guangdong, differ greatly. The degree of difference is greater than a typical British and typical French and typical German. But we live on the same roof of one civilization. There's enormous diversity, you know. So to govern this kind of country, it's always governed by unified ruling entity and based on what we call the Keju system, selection through examinations that China created, introduced into England as civil servant examination system. The Chinese system is still based on that evolution of this system. So if you have the, just imagine EU is a kind of continuation of Roman Empire to this day. It's only less than half of the, roughly half of China's size. Even EU cannot afford a multi-party system, a one person, one vote. The EU will be disintegrated overnight, and the EU headquarters cannot do much about the European integration. So I think China has really learned a lot from its own tradition and also from Western cultures and practices. We have this combination of selection plus election. I think it's better and much better than simply relying on election.
Let's bring Timothy in on this point. So Timothy, the argument here in effect is that China's further along the curve of governance, that they've been at this for 2,000 plus years. And what you and others are characterizing as something as a look back to Leninism is in fact, we're stuck in the past. We're stuck in a governance system that, as Weiwei points out, was formulated in an agrarian society of small male white landholders. So why is Weiwei wrong that China isn't in fact further along the path of governance, courtesy of its history, courtesy of its unification? Let's hear that reply. I think it would be an interesting one for our listeners.
The problem there, Rudyard, is that we're getting awfully Hegelian here, in the sense that we're talking about a direction of history, as if anyone knows the direction of history. Nobody knows the direction of history. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. So there was a certain mistake in liberal triumphalism, which was to believe that the future absolutely, surely, inevitably belonged to, you know, liberal democracies, Western style with universal suffrage and multiple parties and so on. Of course, that was a mistake. But it's just as much a mistake to believe that it belongs to any other model just because of its longevity. And the fact that something is old and has a long history is not of itself decisive of anything. It's what you've made of it more recently, right? I mean, you know, Greece has had 2,500 years experimenting with democracy, but it's still a pretty ropey experiment. The other point I did want to make, though, is about this notion of the civilizational state, because in a sense, Weiwei, and please call me Timothy, because otherwise I'll have to go and call you Professor Zhang again.
Okay.
The point about the civilizational state is that in a sense, calls on you to be Huntingtonian rather than Fukuyama-esque. If you believe that the politics are an expression of the civilization underneath, then the proposition that the Chinese system is superior to liberal democracy becomes almost meaningless, because it may be rather, as Huntington would have argued, that your system, the Chinese system, is good for the Chinese and the American system is good for the Americans. I don't happen to believe that, but it comes out of the logic of your own argument about the civilizational state. I actually believe that while culture and history are very important factors, not to be underrated at all, English culture, French culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, the liberal gamble is that in the end, politics can change culture. And we have many examples of countries like Spain, for example, or Poland, which for much of their history had a conservative, reactionary, closed, authoritarian culture, but through the experience of democracy have become liberal democracies. And one such is, I hesitate to mention it again, Taiwan, rich in Chinese civilization, but very definitely a democracy.
We're going to move towards closing statements in a moment. This has been a fascinating, rich discussion. And I actually did my master's thesis on Hegel, Timothy. So,
I got you.
I felt that barb quite personally, but I'll let that go. But wait, come back on this view that, because it's implied in our motion that the word model suggests that we're debating here that the Chinese model can be exported and that it can be a competitor globally to liberal democracy, that it should be something that China and other countries should adopt as a way of avoiding what you see as the pitfalls of liberal democracy. So I want to hear you push back a bit on Timothy's view that your argument is really cultural. It's specific to China, that this model is not exportable, that it relies on these deep 2,000-year-old cultural traditions to in fact work, and therefore the world really doesn't have much to learn from China. Let's hear your reply to that.
Now, my thesis is quite simple. It's not the intention of the Chinese government, nor me as a scholar, trying to export China model. This itself is very much not part of the Chinese culture. Chinese culture is more or less like, if you really try to lead other countries in one way or another, by setting your own good example. And we do not force you to adopt China model. But what has happened in the world today is, since China is reasonably successful, after all, 40 years ago, China's per capita GDP was lower than most African countries. Now China world's largest economy by purchasing power parity. So this success itself attracts many, many people. In Africa, they talk about looking east. And in many other countries, they are also trying to draw inspiration from China model. We always counsel them, don't copy the Chinese model, but draw on whatever is useful in the context of your own national conditions. And even for this fighting disease, of course, we have by tradition a strong government, a cohesive society, which is great for Chinese civilization, for China's rise. But other countries may adopt their own whatever experience. But this idea, you need social cohesion to fight this disease. This is crucial. Yeah. In addition, I just make 3 quick points concerning concerning Timothy's arguments. One is concerning this Taiwan self-determination. I really counsel our Western friends to be very cautious about self-determination of any region, any ethnic group, any whatever independent or unique entities. Because if you really encourage that, you could have 1,000 nations overnight, they will fight another world war, this is something as a political scientist we must guard against. And second, I made another forecast, which I think Timothy may disagree. I was in UK, in London the other time. They asked me, they said, you have already made the right predictions about Arab Spring, about Donald Trump. So what's your prediction about the UK? I'm one of the few who dare to make forecasts and predictions. I said, my concern is without substantial political reform, especially this referendum system, Great Britain may become Little Britain. Yeah. Really, politics is serious business. It's more than academic debate. So I think UK should take this humble advice from a Chinese scholar into consideration. As I counsel my EU colleague, if only you could have listened to humble advice from a Chinese scholar, you could have avoided this refugee crisis, including Chancellor Merkel. She made a mistake. Yeah. So lastly, indeed, it's not because I'm Chinese, I have a kind of Chinese bias, but it's factually true. If you look at the past 2,000 years as a period of long history, indeed, roughly of this 2,000 years, 2 millennia, China has been the largest economic power for 1,800 years, up to 1820. Yeah. And then China experienced this, unfortunately, this Opium War, and the country began to decline. And we have what we call the central accumulations. And Hong Kong is a last symbol of that, which we try to overcome. But at the same time, China has one very important message to share with our Western friends. That is, we are a culture of learning. We want to learn everything good from other cultures, other civilizations. As Confucius famously said, if you are with two other people, one of them can be your teacher. So we have this, from the top leadership, Xi Jinping Political Bureau, to any workplace, we have these study sessions, regular study session. If you look at the topics they discuss, party political bureau have a study session to study AI technology, to study big data, how it's changed on the society. I said Xi Jinping embraces 2050, Donald Trump embraces 1950. This kind of outlook will mean a lot in the future. We have we try to plan strategically and long vision that really plays well in Chinese culture. There's a civilizational state. You cannot just play next 100 days. That will not work. At least 5 years. So I think all these are the elements which really I think the West could, really sit down and try to learn a bit about Chinese practice, which are good practices.
Okay. So before I come to closing statements, I just want to get Timothy, you to comment on this idea of China as a model to the world. Weiwei is saying that's not the explicit Chinese view or purpose, but Timothy, we have to acknowledge, you would have to acknowledge that many countries, especially developing nations, are now turning to China and are studying, are learning, maybe they're imbuing some Confucius values here and saying, look, there's a powerful combination here of elements of a market system connected to a system of governance that is stressing collective responsibilities and a procedural state. And this has produced very impressive results from China, both within the pandemic and long before. So why isn't the China model going to become an effective international competitor to liberal democracy in the decades to come?
So if I may firstly, because I know this is also going out to a Chinese audience, just one more word on Taiwan. The term self-determination has a specific and a broader meaning. I do not mean it in the specific sense of which groups of people have the absolute right to become a sovereign state and member of the United States. What I do mean is that the people in Taiwan should be able to decide their own future. And I have to say to you, Weiwei, but also to our entire audience, that it would be disastrous for the future of the world if China were in some way or shape or form to try to take over Taiwan by force, because that would lead to something very, very much worse than the First Cold War. So that's just on Taiwan. Now, on the much broader point, I absolutely believe that we now have, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, a serious ideological competitor in the Chinese model of what I would call developmental authoritarianism. And given that we in the West have made such a mess of things, starting with the financial crisis, it's partly not so much that China looks so good, but the West looks so bad. But you're absolutely right. Looked at from Latin America, looked at from Africa, looked at from parts of Asia, as a developmental model, China looks really quite attractive compared to a West that is in crisis in many ways. So that's undoubtedly the case. The question is that the last word to be spoken? Is that the end of the story? No, the story is ongoing. And what I'm trying to argue to you is through the capacity for self-criticism, which is a liberal speciality, if not a liberal passion, the free world, the West, the world of liberal democracies, is much better at reforming itself and is reforming itself. While I do believe the crisis of the Chinese system, not so much because of its Confucian components or traditional Chinese component, but because of its now much more strongly emphasized Leninist component under Xi Jinping, the crisis of the Chinese system is still before us. So I think if we speak again in 10 years' time, it'll be interesting to see where the two stand.
Timothy, that was a lovely summation. Would you like that as your closing statement, or would you like the opportunity to also provide a short closing remarks?
I think that would serve fairly well, don't you?
I think it would very well too. So we'll let Weiwei now have his closing statement. So Weiwei, please take Timothy's remarks as his final summation. Just sum up your key points in this debate and what you want to leave our audience with.
And concerning unification of Taiwan, don't worry about that. I think the two sides of Taiwan Straits eventually will have wisdom to find a good solution. Yeah, and my advice to our Western friends is Deng Xiaoping's famous remark. It's called the emancipation of the mind. In other words, it reminds me of the period of enlightenment, when at that time China was a much more powerful and peaceful empire than European countries, which were split and fighting with each other. At that time, Enlightenment giants like Voltaire, like Spinoza, Leibniz, they've all looked closely into the Chinese experience, including this practice of a courteous system, examination system to select competent officials, etc. And so I think China really can make so much progress. It had to do with Chinese cultural learning. I've learned so much from the West. We are still learning from UK, from United States, from other Western European countries, and we'll continue to do so for China's own benefit. But my really humble counsel to our Western colleague is really put aside whatever your ideological straitjacket, even for one day or 1 week. Try to look at China as it is. It's the most exciting place to be, It's the greatest laboratory in human history, in social, economic, political, legal experiments. Everything is different, And you look at the mindset of the Chinese young people. They are so modern, so outlook. They know West 10 times better than West know what young people know about China, old people know about China. So if really you can put aside ideological, whatever straitjackets and look at China objectively, at least do a simple thing, to know how most Chinese feel about their country, how most Chinese feel about their political system. The Chinese are among the most optimistic people in the world about their political system, about the economic performance, of the future of their personal lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Weiwei&Timothy, just a terrific civil substantive debate. We got into so many of the key issues that I wanted to touch on, and I know our listeners are just hugely appreciative of both of your hard-won insights, clearly the years of thought that you've given to this question of the future of liberal democracy, the future of the China model, and the competition of the two in the decades ahead. So on behalf of the Munk Debates community, thank you both for coming on the program today.